Only 3 years into 1950, Lansky, once the shadowy puppeteer behind untold fortunes, would find himself staring at prison bars, his empire crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. The newspapers were ablaze with tales of infamous criminals, igniting a firestorm of public fascination. The K4 hearings dragged notorious figures into the harsh glare of the spotlight, transforming them into living legends. At the center of these whispers and headlines stood none other than Charlie "Lucky" Luciano. Deported in 1947, Luciano's name still sent shivers through the alleys of New York, where mobsters schemed in smoke-filled backrooms. Frank Costello's name danced through these articles, as did murmurs of the feared Vito Genovese. These men were the titans of crime, operating with the cold efficiency of a machine. Yet the truth behind their operations remained shrouded in speculation, theories slowly solidifying as evidence began to pile up. Red Levine, the enigmatic hitman, had been a whisper in the wind, his legacy reduced to footnotes in organized crime law. Levine, once a loyal enforcer for Luciano, had famously taken part in the murder of Salvatore Maranzano, an assassination that had altered the course of Mafia history. His violent deeds had propelled him to infamy, but finding his name in print was rare, as if his deeds were too dark to be fully uncovered. Despite this, the mention of Levine, alongside these larger-than-life figures, illustrated the brutal reality of the time. No gangster, no matter how ruthless or loyal, was immune to the coming storm. The K4 hearings had another unintended consequence. They cast men like Lansky, Luciano, and Levine into the fabric of American mythology. Suddenly, these criminals were not merely underground figures. They were celebrities. Headlines blared their names like Hollywood stars, and their stories became as gripping as any film noir. But while fame may have stroked their egos, it burned holes in their empires. Meanwhile, Red Levine's shadow lingered over the criminal landscape. Despite rarely being the focus of media attention, his brutal efficiency had kept him firmly entrenched in the underworld's hierarchy. As arrests swept through New York's organized crime circles in 1950, Levine found himself caught in the dragnet, part of a wave of indictments that included hundreds of other mobsters. These sweeping arrests, however, were just a glimpse into the broader chaos. Law enforcement was cracking down in a desperate attempt to sever the roots of the Mafia's sprawling network, and Levine's capture marked the beginning of the end for some of the most untouchable gangsters of the time. The crackdown, led by Chief of Detectives Conrad Rothengast, was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. On a fateful day at Jamaica Racetrack in Queens, detectives swarmed, rounding up 25 criminals in a single swoop. Among them, Levine stood out. The very man who murdered Maranzano. Red was a long-time Luciano associate, his name dripping with the blood of past murders. The operation was part of a larger effort, as police made over 126 arrests in just 24 hours. These weren't just small-time crooks. Men like Anthony Ricci, Capone's former right-hand man, were now in the crosshairs. Ricci, who had once wielded power within the Sicilian Mafia like a king on a chessboard, found himself cuffed and humiliated. The criminal empire was rotting from within, and the raids were simply pushing it into the light. For Meyer Lansky, Red Levine, and their ilk, the 1950s were a battlefield. The golden era of untouchable mobsters was slowly fading as law enforcement and politicians like K4 hammered away at their carefully built empires. Yet even in their downfall, their names remained immortal, entwined with the gritty, dangerous allure of America's criminal underworld. The decade wasn't just an end. It was the transformation of these men from shadowy figures into enduring legends. But the price they paid was high, and the consequences were far from over. The shadows of the past were catching up, and the future held no promises of safety or redemption. The K4 hearings, a relentless campaign by law enforcement to tear apart the Mafia, had done more than just uncover dirty secrets. They had ripped open the soul of organized crime, exposing its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And the men who had once ruled with an iron fist, Costello, Adonis, the Mangano brothers, Genovese, Luciano, Moretti, were now crumbling under the pressure. In the shadowy corridors of organized crime, where loyalty was fragile and ambition was deadly, the internal power struggles of the 1950s churned like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. Lucky Luciano, though exiled in Italy, remained deeply connected to the pulse of New York's criminal underworld. News of the rising tensions, betrayals, and shifting allegiances troubled him, none more so than the quiet but dangerous ascent of Carlo Gambino. Luciano knew all too well that Vito Genovese, despite being troublesome, could be contained. Genovese was a known entity, a bulldog who bit hard but was predictable. However, it was Gambino, with his calm demeanor and calculating patience, which gave Luciano pause. Gambino was not one to rush to power. Like a wolf in sheep's clothing, he maneuvered silently, positioning himself as a key figure within the Mangano crime family, where he served as a lieutenant under the ruthless Albert Anastasia. Alongside Frank Scalise, Gambino had carefully curated his reputation, emerging as the heir apparent to Anastasia's empire. He was a man with ambition, but he wore it like a mask, hidden until the moment was right. Luciano had long seen the writing on the wall. In private conversations with Meyer Lansky, the two masterminds often traded thoughts on the delicate balance of power within the New York families. Lansky, ever the keen observer, predicted with eerie accuracy that one day Anastasia might turn on the Mangano brothers, Phil and Vincent, and take control of the entire organization. The Mangano brothers had long ruled with a heavy hand, but their leadership was waning, and Anastasia's desire for dominance was palpable. True to Lansky's grim forecast, 1951 marked a turning point. Phil Mangano was found dead, his body left as a brutal testament to the internal strife, and Vincent disappeared without a trace, presumed to have met a similar fate. In the wake of their elimination, Anastasia assumed the role of boss, his control now unchallenged. The death of Philip Mangano, a man who once commanded power over Brooklyn's waterfront rackets, sent shockwaves through the Mafia ranks and ignited whispers of betrayal. His body, discovered in the desolate marshlands near Bayside, bullet-riddled and lifeless, was more than a sign of murder. It was the opening act of a bloody purge. Philip Mangano, a 50-year-old racketeer, had been summoned to appear before District Attorney McDonald's investigation. But before he could testify, his body was found lying face down in the dirt, a victim of what was suspected to be a calculated hit. 3 bullets to the head, executed with chilling precision, marked his end, but the story was far from over. A high-ranking police official speaking under anonymity suggested this killing wasn't just another mob hit. It was a warning, an act of silencing a man who had allegedly spoken to federal agents and committee investigators. Mangano, after all, was no small player. He was entangled with the powerful Joe Adonis, a notorious figure in the Mafia's web of criminal dealings. Adonis had recently been cited for contempt of Congress, and Mangano's demise only deepened the suspicion that the K-4 committee's investigation had made the Mafia's inner circle nervous. The official's theory was grim. "This is likely to lead to an all-out war within the Mafia," he said, foretelling a nightmarish chain of events that would see some of the most dangerous men in the underworld sleeping with one eye open. Mangano's death wasn't a simple elimination. It was a power play orchestrated from the highest echelons of the Mafia, a chilling signal that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond reach. Mangano's murder was discovered by Mary Gooch, a middle-aged woman who owned a nearby fishing shack. It was a stroke of dark irony that 2 years earlier she had found another body in nearly the same location. This place, a quiet, forgotten marshland south of Avenue Y, had become a dumping ground for the Mafia's unfinished business. The details of Mangano's death were as stark as they were strange. Dressed in only a white shirt, black socks, and a gold tie clasp, still neatly fixed, his appearance suggested he had been taken by surprise. The rope under his body hinted at a sinister twist, a longshoreman's sling, used not for cargo, but for carrying a man to his death. It was clear Mangano hadn't walked to his final resting place. He had been taken for a ride, his life snuffed out elsewhere before his body was discarded like refuse. This killing bore all the hallmarks of an inside job, one that Vincent Mangano, Philip's brother, and another top mafia figure could not ignore. Philip's murder sent shockwaves not just through the streets of Brooklyn, but throughout the entire underworld. Vincent had been dodging investigators, and now, with his brother dead, he vanished completely. Whispers ran through the Mafia that Vincent might be next, that this purge was far from over. For those who dared speculate, this was not just the death of a racketeer, but the start of a Mafia war unlike any seen before. Tensions between rival factions had reached a breaking point. The old ways, reminiscent of the brutal bootlegging days, seemed to be returning with a vengeance. And as the blood spilled, men like Joe Adonis and Frank Costello stood accused of orchestrating the chaos, while the shadowy figure of Albert Anastasia loomed, waiting for his chance to seize power. The death of Philip Mangano was only the first strike in a larger, more dangerous game, a game where the cost of loyalty was life and the price of betrayal was death. As the weeks unfolded, it became clear that no one was safe. The purge had begun, and in the world of the Mafia, retribution was inevitable. As the fallout from Philip Mangano's murder spread through the streets of Brooklyn, the focus shifted to a man who had long managed to dodge the spotlight: Frank Costello. On the surface, Costello, often called the Prime Minister of the underworld, appeared calm, collected, and untouchable. But behind the scenes, his name was whispered in the same breath as the most dangerous men in the Mafia. So, when Brooklyn District Attorney investigators dragged him into questioning about the murder of Mangano, it felt like the very air in the criminal world held its breath. Costello's questioning, handled by Assistant District Attorney Louis Andreozzi, might have seemed like an effort to crack open a treasure trove of Mafia secrets, but the results were as expected: silence. As stoic as ever, Costello gave the investigators nothing. His reputation preceded him. A man who could talk for hours and say absolutely nothing, and that's precisely what happened during his meeting with Andreozzi. His lawyer, George Wolfe, stood by his side, as impenetrable as his client. The questioning was a formality, nothing more. District Attorney Miles MacDonald, undeterred by Costello's silence, explained the reasoning behind the interrogation. "We are bringing in any witnesses who might be able to tell us about Mangano's associates. Once we know more about his connections, we can proceed from there." But everyone in that room knew the truth. If Costello knew anything about Philip Mangano's death, he wasn't about to reveal it. Not now, not ever. Still, the questioning opened the door to another name that sent shivers through the streets of Brooklyn: Joe Adonis. A Brooklyn mobster with deep ties to Mangano, Adonis had recently been cited for contempt of Congress after refusing to testify at the Kefauver hearings. Now he was next on the list. Though MacDonald indicated that Adonis would be questioned somewhere outside of this office, the tension was palpable. When Adonis sat down with investigators, it was unlikely they would get any more out of him than they had from Costello. And then there was Albert Anastasia, the brutal and feared king of the dock rackets, whose name hovered over this investigation like a dark cloud. Anastasia, alongside lower-level Mafia figures like Tony Spring and Joe Fiorino, were names that came up repeatedly as possible targets for questioning. But MacDonald, perhaps wary of pushing too hard, remained non-committal. The interview with Costello had dampened his enthusiasm for interrogating other Mafia big shots, at least for now. However, the name on everyone's mind was Vincent Mangano, the older brother of the slain Philip. Vincent had been a ghost since the Kefauver Committee began digging into the waterfront rackets that the Mangano brothers ruled with an iron fist. While the committee had managed to track down Philip before his death, Vincent had vanished. And now, as investigators tried to piece together the puzzle of Philip Mangano's murder, they were desperate to find Vincent, whose disappearance seemed more suspicious by the day. Some believed that if Philip Mangano hadn't spoken to the Kefauver Committee, he might still be alive. That suspicion, whether true or not, hung like a dark spectre over the investigation. The Mafia's code of silence, omerta, was the invisible thread tying all these men together. Costello, Adonis, Anastasia, and even the elusive Vincent Mangano. They were all bound by a common understanding. In this world, loyalty could mean the difference between life and death. And for Philip Mangano, it had already sealed his fate. Vincent Mangano vanished without a trace around April 19th, leaving behind one of the most perplexing mysteries in Mafia history. To this day, no one knows what truly happened to him, and his murder remains unsolved. For years, every time a body was discovered in New Jersey, New York, or Brooklyn, newspapers would run the story, and families would brace themselves, wondering if it was Mangano. But each time, it wasn't him. His body never surfaced, and the crime that ended his life became one of the most infamous cold cases in organized crime. Yet, while the truth of his fate was hidden in the shadows, the aftermath of his disappearance was undeniable. Powerful figures like Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and others convened for a pivotal meeting. It was there that Anastasia, ever the calculating predator, made a chilling admission. He believed that the Mangano brothers were plotting to take him down, so he struck first. In the ruthless world of the Mafia, this was the only language they understood: kill or be killed. Lucky Luciano, ever pragmatic, simply shrugged at the news. "It is what it is," he declared, knowing that nothing could be done to change the course now. He also warned that no further action should be taken, not with Senator Estes Kefauver's relentless hearings still casting a spotlight on organized crime. Costello, always thinking strategically, saw merit in Anastasia's move. After all, Anastasia was fiercely loyal to both him and Luciano, far more so than the Manganos ever were. But in this dangerous game, Costello underestimated the unpredictable nature of Anastasia. He was a loose cannon, volatile, uncontrollable, and quick to lash out. He had a penchant for promoting mobsters one day, only to publicly humiliate and demote them the next. His erratic behavior sparked resentment, especially in those who had once enjoyed his favor. Carlo Gambino, a sharp and calculating man, had been the underboss since 1946, only to find himself demoted and promoted again in a dizzying game of power that was less about rank and more about Anastasia's whims. While others might have seethed with rage, Gambino wisely swallowed his pride. He knew that making noise would only hasten his downfall. Instead, he chose patience, waiting for the right moment. Because Gambino understood something that others didn't. Albert Anastasia was digging his own grave. All Gambino had to do was bide his time and let Anastasia's own reckless nature take him down. The stage was set, the pieces were in motion, and Gambino was ready to seize the opportunity when the moment came.